Hello, and welcome to the Tiare Speaks podcast. If you could take a second to like, share, if you feel so inclined, or even subscribe, it would really help me out. On today's episode, it is one that really hits home for a lot of Canadians right now, and I think even in the United States as well, because we're neighbors and we coherently affect each other on an economical level. In Canada, we have the carbon tax. It's something you guys probably see on TikTok, something you see on YouTube, on social media, all over the place. You see it. And the biggest issue that a lot of Canadians have is not only that we have the number one carbon tax, now we have the second carbon tax that just came into effect this April. And to kind of give you guys perspective, in 2019, the price per ton for carbon was $20 per ton. Since then, now in 2024, it's now quadrupled. So now the price per ton is $80 per ton. So it's crazy. It's ridiculous. The amount of things that have been affected by the carbon tax, the food. So like it goes from the farmers, and then the farmers get reamed for it, and the people on the trucks who carry the food to our stores and everything, they get taxed, and then the companies get taxed, and blah 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 blah, right? And they end up charging outrageous amounts. Like, I remember the days when we paid, $3 for a gallon of milk, or if that, I think, or like $2.50 for a carton of eggs or whatever, $3 for butter and like whatever else. Now we're paying an astronomical amount on our food. Like, let alone right now, the milk in our stores is almost $6 for a gallon of milk. I'm talking about the 3.25% milk. You know, Dairyland milk. Like, it is outrageous what we're paying right now for milk. Yeah. It's milk, not just milk though, like a bunch of other things too. Like, we're talking about ground beef, we're talking about, you know, fish, any kind of seafood, and everything in all outrageous ways has gone up. I know myself, for my family and we are big into couponing and using points or whatever whenever we can because of the same things. It's something that's deeply concerning right now. I know that in the parliamentary snippets I've seen, and the arguments I've seen back and forth between Pierre Poilievre and Trudeau, the running theme I seem to see is a lot of the deflection, especially by the Liberals. They are continuously deflecting questions when they're asked of them. I know one recently when I was watching, because I'm very interested in things like this because this is our country, right? These are the people running our country, and affecting change in our country effectively, right? So one of the things that I noticed they mentioned was the 200 billion spending budget this year. 200 billion spending budget for the year 2024. And I'm sitting here and listening to all the amount of stuff that they're going to be, putting our tax dollars towards. And it's absolutely ridiculous. The carbon tax is essentially a tax that they get to pocket at this point. Like, that's what it is, right? Like, they're pocketing themselves, their corruption, and whatever else. The Deputy of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, I think it is, for Canada. You know, she's constantly asked, do you have a plan for the future? Fortunate thing is whenever she's asked a question, everybody else answers for her. She doesn't have the right to answer the question. It's almost like she is continuously told to shut up and not say a word. When, you know, we all have our Charter of Rights, that we all have the freedom to speech, even in parliaments, the place that we should be the most free to speak. Um, Whenever she was directly answered questions, somebody else would answer. Or the best technique that Trudeau has, especially when I've seen him face Poilievre in Parliament, is deflection. So, like, Pierre Poilievre will ask him, hey, axe a tax, let this be the carbon tax election, you know? And he'll kind of just come back and just make some random statement about something else. And it's kind of like, well, buddy, like, why don't you answer the question? Clearly, you don't want to answer the question because you don't have any intention of axing the tax. Because if you axe the tax, then you don't get your pockets lined anymore, right? Our hard-earned tax dollars that we're, you know, paying towards is literally paying for nothing because we're not getting new housing initiatives. We're not getting new green initiatives, no investments into clean energy. We're just getting increased food prices, increased housing costs and scarcity, and no initiatives for that, right? So the quadrupling of everything, the cost of living here in British Columbia, let's just talk about British Columbia because that's where, you know, where most of this is affected because we don't, in British Columbia, we don't get a tax, the carbon tax rebate. I think it's mainly because we get other rebates here in the province. Um, but the other provinces, it's quite funny. I think I had heard Pierre Poilievre speak on this in Parliament. He had said that it was like roughly $1,800 for the tax rebate per Albertan, you know, in Alberta. And the cost of the carbon tax was like 2,900 and some change. So the rebate is 18 something, but the cost is nearly double. Or no, not nearly double. It would be quite substantially more than what they're getting rebated. So like the rebate wouldn't even cover what the cost of the carbon tax is, what it's costing them. You know, one thing, it was funny because I was talking to my husband about this. And one of the statements he made, which I thought was pretty interesting, was, you know, the original 13 colonies in the United States went to war because the British at the time wanted to raise the taxes to some asinine amount. And they went to war for that. Now, I'm not saying that we should all go to war because Pierre Poilievre or because Trudeau is continuing with taxes. It just makes me think, you know, if any of you have done the history of France and have studied the monarchy in France, there was the very famous monarch Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. During this time, Marie Antoinette is most known for her statement, "Let them eat cake." And when I think about it, it's very similar because they increased the taxes in order for them to have the supplements that they needed for war and for their luxuries that they were living in. And they continued to live their lives while the people lived in squalor, didn't have barely enough anything to eat, nothing they were able to affordably get. And so it's kind of interesting when I draw that parallel between them both because there's so many similarities in that regard, you know. Yeah, like for Marie Antoinette, it was let them eat cake. You know, I don't give a crap about these people because it doesn't affect me. And Trudeau is the same way, you know. He says he does by giving us a huge amount of money, but at the end of the day, the instant satisfaction of getting that credit will pick us hard in the butt later, you know, because of the rate of inflation will rise, right? I guarantee you, if any of these politicians had to live in any similarity of the ways that low-income people have to live in housing where the landlords are abusive and disgusting and just nasty, or they had to work for minimum wage, and not only that, but just have to deal with the astounding prices and not being able to make ends meet and whatever, I guarantee you, if they had to live that way, things would change drastically. Or if they all had to take a pay cut in Parliament, right? You know, I cannot imagine how much our country would change drastically if they just had to be in our shoes and experience the things that we're all experiencing, you know, how the rents have gone up, the mortgages have gone up down payments 2 to 4 times than 2020, or even before that, 2019. The biggest problem right now is that currently, based off our numbers right now, 46% of Canadians believe that the carbon tax hasn't actually had any effectiveness in climate change, which is correct, because the biggest issue in our country is that we have many green teams that come up with wonderful ideas and things and technologies that will help us and help our future generations and everything. But the problem is they put a cap on that spending. And once it's reached the cap, they don't spend anymore. And so companies are left with two options. Either they can sell to the highest bidder, or they end up selling to the United States because they invest in those things. And when people invest in those things, then they get usually a lot better, right? Especially, you know, with this green initiatives all over the place. You know, and it's really sad because these are Canadian companies that are Canadian citizens that are trying to improve their country, but can't do it because either they don't have an investor to continue funding their products, or they have to end up selling out because they just can't keep it up, right, without support. So the government ends up not supporting them, so they end up having to be bought out by an American company or the highest bidder. And it's really unfortunate because there's been wonderful ideas that have had to have been sold out. We can't keep any of our own Canadians here. I mean, look at the example of our doctors, our nurses, our first responders, our healthcare system that is so deeply weighed by the lack of healthcare professionals. Most of healthcare professionals, even if they're trained here in the country, in Canada, once they're trained and they graduate, they leave and they go to the United States. Why? Because they pay them exactly what they should be getting, not any less. And that's what the way it is, you know. Here in British Columbia, most of the doctors that get trained here, they leave and they go to the United States because that's where the money is at. I know, like, many of my friends who study to become nurses, mainly a lot of them at BYU, Idaho, and they left, they were done the program, and they're like, hey, like, I want to be a travel nurse. They got their, you know, documents and whatever, and that's what they're doing now. They're travel nurses, and they make bank, a huge amount of money every month in the United States, and they have their travel visas or they have their PR, and they just go around and that's what they do. And you know what? Like, my hat's off to them because it's nothing in comparison to the overloaded system here in Canada. Like, we have ER wait times that are surpassing capacity. We, you know, many examples like here in in our town, we my husband had a circumstance where he had lymph node that unfortunately needed to get drained, and he went to the ER. He sat in the ER for I don't know how long, like 6 hours. Finally brought him back to the back. They got him in a room, and this freaking fresh newbie doctor, from what it was, from the sounds of it, was cutting my husband, cutting the lymph node open so then they can, drain it. And the idiot cuts my husband's artery, and he's just like, "Oh, it's just not stopping to bleed. I'm sorry, blah blah blah." And he ends up just, patching him up and then sending him on his way. He gets home, and I remember he was wearing my orange Carhartt sweater. And he comes home, and he's white as a sheet. And he lifts his arm up, and then it's just gushing blood on the side of his arm. And at the time, I was recovering from my C-section from our second child's birth. And so I call up my mom. I'm like, "Mom, Joe's like bleeding a lot, and I can't go out and drive him because the baby's sleeping," and blah blah blah. So she runs over here, grabs him, brings him back to the ER, and they end up having to do sutures and to like close the wound because it's just bleeding a lot. And he was literally bleeding on the floor until a nurse was able to notice. It was like, "Oh, you're like actually bleeding," you know. So like if we had nurses that were paid adequately to what their their level of education is, that I mean, really appreciated, we would retain more of our healthcare professionals. We would be able to have more healthcare professionals because they'd be incentivized to stay because they were being paid what the competition is paying them, right? And so, going back to the carbon tax, the biggest things right now is what are the initiatives that they could be doing? In 2020, as cited by NASA, during the local lockdowns brought that were brought fast by global interruptions with the pandemic, our global ozone reduced. So that means that the ozone was starting to repair itself in those times of lockdown where, our world essentially shut down. And now, mentioning this, that doesn't mean that I'm saying, hey, we should just shut down the entire world, because this is nonsense. What I'm saying is those moments where we had to pause and take a second really made a huge difference for our planet. Now, the question is, how do we affect change? How do we affect change without all this mumbo jumbo corruption bullshit from our Prime Minister? Well, here are some ideas. Some of the greatest ideas, I personally think, are wind turbines. Why don't we have wind turbines in the prairies? That is a wonderful way to produce electricity, to help in ways that are more sustainable. What about green gardens for every community in like everywhere in British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, you know, having those initiatives to do those. Like, what about like more incentives for for green projects, more funding, so then we're able to have those things. Because let's be real now, like in itself, this parliament has not spent any money towards green initiatives. I haven't seen anything. Have you guys? Put it in the comments below. If you guys have seen anything or any improvements in that regard, please put it in the comments below, because in my research, I didn't find anything that they had done better. You know, I see so many improvements being done in the cities. And that's great, because obviously you want to revitalize your city to make sure you keep people coming in and whatnot. But, you know, you look at my town and you look at it from the state it was 7 years ago. And I think I can say this, like many towns in British Columbia, I think it's absolutely asinine the amount of homelessness we have, whether it was caused by their own doing or their unfortunate circumstances. It's just something that's becoming more and more prevalent. Unfortunately, it's something I will be touching on in our next episode, because our next episode is going to be talking a lot about that stuff. So I won't say too much because I don't want to take from that. But what I will say is kind of going back to the time with the French Revolution, or sorry, the Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. I think it's very, very interesting when you draw those two parallels, because it's essentially the same thing, the same things that we're struggling with. Marie Antoinette and the Dauphin were trying to control a country that was massive. We're talking about a 14-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy. They were trying to run a massive country like France. They were taxing people through the roof, and they were barely able to eat food. I think I remember in the history books that I was reading when I was a kid, they mentioned how they would pump out milk from the castle every so often. They would literally go, and there were these pumps that they would pump on the side of the castle walls to be able to get milk. And they would just beg, and they would sit there just to get milk for their children and for, you know, their lives. And it makes me kind of think of the same thing. The level of corruption, the level of disgust that I feel for my country is just abhorrent. Like, you know, I love this country. I have grown up in this country. All I've known is Canada. Canada is where I not essentially, was born. I became a citizen, you know, and it's all I've ever known. You asked me before Trudeau got elected, you know, I would say I was still proud of my country. Obviously, there's a lot of areas that every country has to work in. But I would have said that I'm proud of my country. I still am to this day. There are a lot of things to be proud of in my country. I'm proud that we have an inclusion thing for kids in our classrooms, because that's super important. But there are very few things now because of so many other things that have come to light, you know, so many things. It just makes me more frustrated, because I am a proud Canadian. It is a frustrating part when you can't be proud of your country because of the decisions that the leaders are making on our behalf, essentially, right? So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is the biggest issue. We need an acid tax. So when voting time comes to the polls, guys, let's hope that the things even out. Because when we look at it from a logical standpoint, the problem that we have here on the West Coast is that our hold in Parliament right now is not, meaning the seats available in Parliament are not as big as the amount of seats that the East holds in Parliament, meaning the East has more seats in Parliament than the West does. I believe the number is like 203 to 100 and something. So they're always going to have more pull. And what my hope is this time around, this next election, my hope is that these people from the East Coast are seeing all of this, and hopefully we can remove this tyrant from Parliament, and we can have some other hopeful conservative, because I am conservative, conservative member in the government, so that we can get things back to rolling to the way they were. Yeah, I really hope that we can axe the tax. That's where it goes, axe the tax. And actually line our pockets, not like fake line our pockets just to mitigate an immediate satisfaction, only to, hurt us in the long run. Anyways, thank you so much for listening to the podcast today, guys. I really appreciate any and all support for the podcast. It would be really wonderful if you could share this podcast, or even comment. It always helps a ton. As a mom of kiddos who are neurodiverse, I've searched high and low for a brand to help my kiddos feel comfortable, and Little and Lively did just that. She's a local mom who has a small shop who focuses not only on the quality of clothing, but making sure that it's ethically and responsibly made. For you, my viewers, I have a 15% off code that you can use on everything you purchase through the link I've posted in my description box below. I think it's really great. We want to support local and make sure that we get in that support for our local businesses. This month's podcast recommendation is The Good Inside by Dr. Becky. She is one of the most aforementioned psychologists here in British Columbia. And she has a wonderful podcast that I listen to as kids with deeply feeling kids. She's a wonderful person that I hope one day we can get on the podcast so that we can have a wonderful conversation about our children and just getting some good coping skills with that. Please tune in next week as I post on a weekly basis. I'm so sorry, guys, this last week was a little crazy for the fam, and we will resume on Friday as normal. I'm super excited to hear what you guys think. Please post in the comments below. I'm signing off for now. Bye, y'all.